Vancouver is home to dozens of craft breweries, mainly in the Main Street Mount Pleasant area. But what isn't as well known is the fact that Vancouver's beer scene is practically as old as the city itself. Now, a new book is telling the story of that industry, condensing more than a century of brewing into one single narrative. Here to talk about Brewmasters and Brewery Creek, a history of craft beer in Vancouver, then and now, is historian Noëlle Phillips. Welcome.
Good morning.
So, Noel, easy question to get us going. What made you write the book? I take it the story hasn't been told quite like this before.
I initially had written a book about the longer history of beer and brewing until the Middle Ages. This is obviously not the only history of beer, but I wrote a medieval history of it. And then I looked at how modern breweries adapt medieval history in their marketing. And that led me into an exploration of what was happening in craft brewing in Vancouver. So I quickly became interested in the much more local history, and I realized that Vancouver has many rich and exciting stories involving pioneer brewers all the way from the founding in 1886 until today. So I wanted to find a way of telling the story in a manner that was interesting, that maybe let people know things they hadn't heard of before, and kind of uncovered some stories about breweries and brewmasters that had never been heard.
Now, take us back to the beginning, or almost the beginning. Where was Brewery Creek, and is its legacy still being felt today?
Yeah, absolutely. Brewery Creek had basically traveled from what is now Tea Swamp Park in Vancouver. It sort of meandered down and emptied into False Creek. And it traveled past where is now Main Street Brewing and Brass Neck, not too far from R&B and 33 Acres. And it ended essentially where Red Truck is now. And where Red Truck is were a couple of other breweries, Lansdowne and a couple of others. And that was actually where False Creek was before the city started to fill it in. So for a long time, I mean, and even to this day, Brewery Creek is under the pavement of the city. It's just, it's been buried. We can't really hear it anymore, but even until the mid-century, you could open certain manhole covers, hear it going by. But the reason it was called Brewery Creek was that it became a resource, a power source, a water source for the very first breweries in Vancouver.
And it was among the casualties when Vancouver began filling up False Creek around 1913 for railroad tracks, I believe it was.
Yeah, exactly. So that, I mean, it was such an important part of the city's landscape and then just gone, right? But by that point, most of the breweries, the independent breweries, had shut down. Brewery consolidation had happened and prohibition was looming. So we didn't see craft beer around there again until, the late 20th century, essentially.
Now, the first half of the book runs roughly from 1886 until about 1920 or so, charting the birth, growth, and death of independent beer culture. Before we get into what sparked the temporary death of it, what began it? So how did Vancouver become this hotbed of brewing?
Well, Victoria was actually well ahead of Vancouver at the time. And it's really thanks to immigrants from areas that really valued beer, so namely England and Germany. The one brewery that really got things kicked off in Vancouver was called Vancouver Brewery. It went through a few different names. Its owner, Charles Doering, had initially moved to Victoria, where he worked kind of as an assistant at a brewery. He worked as a mechanic, and realized that there's a lot of money in the booze industry. He opened his own saloon, and he saw all these breweries in Victoria and went to Vancouver and realized there's essentially none. There's one very small one. But it was really him that said, "Hey, I can make Vancouver feel like home for other German immigrants." And so he was the first one to really kickstart the industry. Then we have others following him, and it's really a part of immigrants finding a home in Vancouver, of not just importing their beer, but really making beer that felt like home, making it in this new country. So I think we owe a lot to those German and English immigrants for sure.
Now, let's define our terms a little bit because you get into this and it's interesting. It's what do we mean when we say craft breweries? Because I understand this is something of a contested term even now.
It is. So the definition of craft brewery now has to do with ownership, like it can't be owned by a larger company. It has to do with number of hectoliters produced a year. It can't go over a certain amount. Those two criteria are kind of the main ones. Joe Wiebe in his book Craft Beer Revolution talks about this a bit more. It is defined by the Canadian Craft Brewers Association in Canada, by the Brewers Association in the US. But it's something that you kind of, as Joe Wiebe says, you know it when you see it, when you taste it. We call it craft now because we think of it as locally made, locally owned, kind of small businesses. But it used to be called a microbrewery. And for the purposes of the book, I also call it just independent brewing, because I'm really looking at the breweries that were owned and run independently before consolidation, before kind of corporate brewery ownership became something that essentially shapes the landscape. So craft brewery, microbrewery, independent brewing, I sort of see them all under that umbrella of independent local brewing.
Now, as you state in the book, prohibition is often blamed for the death of Vancouver's original craft breweries, but as you argue, it wasn't the cause; it was merely the nail in the coffin. We're talking, of course, regulatory tax changes and corporate consolidation as well, contributing to that.
Yeah, it's prohibition in BC only lasted 1917 to 1921, but it came at a time, it was sort of a combination of forces. It came at a time that really enabled corporate beer to gain a foothold and essentially destroyed the possibility of any more independent breweries cropping up. And the consolidation of breweries, the merging together of large breweries was starting around the turn of the century already. We could sort of see it beginning because it seemed like a really feasible way to kind of do business. And in fact, you have some reporters and other people kind of praising it, saying it's not about monopolies, it's about keeping breweries in business. But of course, it did become about monopolies. And you have basically three huge breweries dominating Canada for most of the 20th century. So from kind of 1912 until 1982, we don't really see that independent brewery culture had essentially disappeared. We don't really see it in Canada, definitely not in BC. So
As you put it, all roads led to big beer.
yeah, yeah, exactly. When you look at Vancouver Brewery and all the mergers it went through, it essentially became, what is now Molson. So
Now, the book deliberately skips over decades of history because, as you say, the bulk of the 20th century dominated by the narratives of corporate beer. But by the late 70s, early 80s, consumers, growers are getting fed up with corporate beer and they're thirsty for change, any change to the status quo. And then to me, it all comes to a head in the summer of 1978 when you have the lockout of Canada's big three brewers lasting 4 painful months, and this seems to be the catalyst of the modern independent brewery scene. Unpack that a bit. What happened there?
yeah, so when that lockout happened, the brewery workers were advocating for, various kinds of rights improvement and working conditions, and they were locked out of their jobs, and the owners were trying to run the breweries, and they couldn't. They ran out of beer. BC had no beer. People were bootlegging Budweiser into Vancouver on their pleasure boats, and Canadian beer's reputation took a real hit. And we see a major change in attitudes through the work of actually a guy that worked for Big Beer, and his name was Frank Appleton. He wrote something called the Underground Brewmaster for a homesteading magazine. And this article, Underground Brewmaster, essentially showed his subversive spirit. He was sick of Big Beer. He was sick of brewmasters sort of just pushing buttons, not actually having any freedom, not making good beer. He talks about Big Beer as missing everything that is supposed to make beer beer, missing all of those important qualities. And when he wrote that article, he had already kind of quit his job. and other people were reading it. So there was a gentleman in West Vancouver named John Mitchell who owned a pub. He wanted to get, the campaign for real ale that was happening in England. He wanted to get it happening in Vancouver. He saw this article and he actually drove out with his wife to the Kootenays, where Frank Appleton was homesteading, and asked, "Would you help me make beer for my pub? I'm going to try to get the laws changed." And the two of them together made a business plan. They met with ministers and the head of the liquor control branch, and it was a long process. But by 1982, they were the first people in Canada to be making beer on site independently. The first people since Prohibition, essentially. And that was at the Troller Pub in Horseshoe Bay. The brewery was called Horseshoe Bay Brewery, but it could not actually be part of the pub. They had to be on a different property. There's lots of really silly laws that BC had in place. But it was the first time we saw kind of real beer again in Canada.
And there's a series of legislative changes that sort of bring us to the present day. Brew pubs are permitted to distribute off premises as of the year
Mhm.
2000. The tasting room legislation that was enacted in 2013. Uh, what would you say the state of the industry is now?
Um, there's a lot of dire predictions about the industry right now with the closure of many beloved breweries, which is really sad to see. I think context is important. I think that we've seen actually quite a few ups and downs since 1982. And I think this feels particularly painful because of how much that tasting room legislation you mentioned, 2013, changed the landscape for breweries. So the growth since 2013 has been unprecedented. It has skyrocketed. We've seen an explosion in the brewery industry like we've never seen before, which has been amazing, but it's also not sustainable over the long term. So as the industry sort of evens out post COVID, we're seeing seeing what I think is a natural retraction in the industry, because we simply can't keep growing at the rate. The tasting room legislation allowed breweries to serve on site, to let people drink on site, and this actually used to be not allowed. Well, it was allowed in wineries. So I think that people are actually going to see a lot of positive growth in the industry after this, despite this pain for the individual breweries. I think we're going to see increased quality of craft breweries and a more sort of solid, stable sense of growth in the industry as we perhaps go back to more core styles, maybe less sort of one-off beers, and working on quality and consistency a lot more rather than trying to sort of shock or stun people, which I know is can be kind of fun. But I think there is a turn back towards maybe more traditional brewing styles, more slow growth and sustainable growth. So I actually think there's a lot of positive things to look forward to, despite the difficulties of the past couple of years.
When we talk about the difficulties of the past couple of years, is it the pandemic, or is it this expansion that wasn't sustainable that you think is the problem?
I think it's both, and I think that I agree with um, Joe Weeb has talked about this. He was saying that the natural retraction that probably would have happened around the time of the pandemic in 2020 was prevented because buying habits changed, government loans were given out. There were many breweries that were able to stay afloat in the pandemic when actually and this seems counterintuitive, but whereas they might have slowly kind of gone out of business without that shift. There were more people buying at home, there was increased packaging. So in a strange way, the pandemic actually helped extend the business lives of some breweries, and also kind of delay that natural retraction that probably would have happened earlier, after that explosion of growth post 2013.
Now, you talked about this a little bit just now, but what's next for the industry? A retraction, perhaps some consolidation? What?
I hope not too many consolidations. I know that we see in recently Vancouver Island Brewing is now sort of having to brew under Phillips on the island because of costs. Property costs are going to affect the industry, there's no doubt. I do think that the turn back towards more traditional and kind of solid styles is a good sign that we don't need to do the newest, weirdest version of an IPA to make money. I see more breweries working on making quality lagers and pilsners, and more people interested in those. And it used to be like years ago that the craft beer heads would be like, oh, it's just only IPA that I'm into, and like people were kind of done with lagers and pilsners. It felt too much like big beer. We're back now to those really conventional styles, to the styles that actually made that those 19th century brewers helped them make their mark in the city. So when I go to a craft brewery, I always want to try their pilsner or another form of lager and sort of see what they can make. Because if you can make a good lager, you can make a good almost anything else.
What do you hope folks get out of the book?
I hope they are entertained, interested in local history, and I honestly hope that it gives visibility to so many of the people in this industry who have kind of been hidden behind the scenes, behind the kind of fancy branding, all the people that have done so much kind of unacknowledged work to make their breweries what they are, to bring more diversity into the industry, to welcome more, to make more people feel welcome. An industry that kind of used to be a lot of, beards and plaid shirts, I think is becoming much more welcoming and inclusive and diverse. There's still work to do, but I want to make those people visible because it's thanks to them that the industry is what it is.
And this is a quick aside. You talk about Charles During, but as well, you talk about someone like Mary Mueller, who is a bit of an unsung hero and quite the character.
Yeah, she was essentially one of the first female brewery owners ever in BC. We see some later female brewery owners in the 1980s and 90s, but Mary was she ran her tap room at Columbia Brewery, which is kind of near where Parallel 49 is now, with an iron fist. She was brought into court for really beating up a customer with a horsewhip because she'd heard he'd gossiped about her around town. She had a long time marriage with her first husband, and he apparently just loved her dearly. He did a lot of things for her. He's very protective of her. But she also didn't feel bad about breaking the law. She was always serving illegally, and she knew the law well enough that she found these little loopholes that she attempted to use in court. Sometimes they worked, sometimes they didn't. But you had to sort of admire her for trying to make a go of it.
These great hidden histories that we don't know enough about. Thank you for this.
Yeah, thanks for chatting with me.
The name of the book is Brewmasters and Brewery Creek, a history of craft beer in Vancouver then and now. It's available from Touchwood Editions. There it is. Thank you so much, Noel. Appreciate this.
Thanks. Thank you.